it's just that it's this week. This week I want to talk about. Okay, this week I want to talk about Sons of Liberty that debuted on the History Channel this week.
This is just the beginning.
So this week, the History Channel showed a new miniseries, a new dramatic retelling of the Revolutionary War period called Sons of Liberty, which was mostly about Sam Adams and John Hancock and John Adams, sort of. The History Channel at some point became not about history and sort of a joke, right? Because we have Swamp People, we have Pawn Stars, which I actually kind of enjoy watching, I admit, but it's not history. Pawn Stars, they have another show about American Pickers, that's the one I'm thinking of. Just shows that have nothing virtually to do with history, that are these strange sort of Americana sort of things. So they're really not about history in a lot of senses anymore. But they've really done a couple of big specials lately about history. They had the World Wars special here about a year ago, which sort of moved me to do a long rant about American exceptionalism. If you go back to that video about me talking about how much I dislike American exceptionalism, and that video was very much geared towards those beliefs that I find disagreeable in academia. And they did a Harry Houdini one, which was sort of historic, which wasn't very good because the writing was poor. The acting was actually pretty good in that one. And now they released Sons of Liberty, and I was interested because the Revolutionary War period is one of my favorite periods of American history. It's a very interesting time about how everything transpired, and really that's what I studied the most, was the Revolutionary period up until the end of the War of 1812. I spent a lot of time studying that era, so I know the era fairly well, and I expected to see certain things transpire and happen, and well, it's almost hard to describe how historically false Sons of Liberty. It's not even inaccurate, because inaccuracy within historical drama is pretty common. It happens a lot. There's little things here and there that are just wrong, but overall they don't detract from the narrative being told and don't detract from the historical significance or insignificance of something. But this was just false. The history built in Sons of Liberty is not real. It's completely, it's fiction. It's a fanfic. It's like the Revolutionary War told from an 80s action hero standpoint. Okay, let's start with, there's so much to criticize here that I'm actually having a hard time starting the criticism of this work. Sons of Liberty, let's start with the main character, which is Sam Adams here. And in this they have him as, he's wearing like the very modern chic stubble beard, which he wouldn't have done. He'd been clean shaven, because almost everybody was clean shaven in those days. That was the look. Most people shaved clean in the 1700s. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that facial hair would come back. So he would have been clean shaven, but they got him with this weird stubble beard, looking very young and robust, and he's this young, hip rebel James Dean type, which is really odd to me, because Sam Adams was a politician and a man of rhetoric, and he was in his early 40s to early 50s during the period which the movie takes place, which in those days was an old man. It's middle-aged by today's standards, and so he's not young regardless. He's either middle-aged or he's old. But Sam Adams was certainly not this brazen fighter, drunkard, sort of foolish. He was very much a smart, sophisticated, educated, wealthy. He had failed in some of his business ventures, but he still had quite a bit of money. He was still considered part of the elite of Boston. So being this rabble-rouser is just, it's odd. I mean, in ways spiritually maybe it's sort of right, because Sam Adams was very incendiary in his talk, and he pushed people to really push back against the crown, and so maybe that part kind of works, but overall the characterization just doesn't feel like legitimate in any way, not anything I've ever read about Sam Adams. Because like I said, he's a middle-aged man, he's a businessman, he's very smart, he's very charismatic. He's not really one to go out and do fighting himself. Like they show him this all the time fighting, which is odd, because I don't remember hearing anything about Sam Adams in battle. He was a politician and very, very good at speaking and very good at making his points, and that's why he was such an important leader. And then they have John Hancock, and I'm just going to go down the list here, because it's almost all bad. John Hancock, who's this silly, poofy, sort of very self-indulgent businessman who's only moved when the British take away his money. He says that later towards the end of the miniseries that he's inspired by Sam Adams because you pushed me this way. No, it's the British who pushed him this way in this series because they make him broke, and which is a little bit true. John Hancock did lose quite a bit of money. John Hancock was probably one of the richest people in the United States before the Revolution, and being really hesitant in this miniseries seemed odd to me because John Hancock has always seemed like a person who was on board, and he was friends with Sam Adams, and they were both very good at speaking and didn't care for British rule anymore, and you could argue it was partially because greed, because John Hancock knew he could make more money in an independent country than he could under the British Empire. And Sam Adams was the same way. Sam Adams was a merchant, and he'd been a failed brewer, but the point is that these were both moneyed men who stood to financially gain from a revolution, but at the same time probably did have some very fundamental beliefs that the British should not be ruling in the Americas anymore, especially what would become the United States. They'd been reading the philosophy of the day. They'd read John Locke, they'd read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They come back to Cicero and Latin and things like this, and so they had this very democratic sense that was emerging in the mid 1700s and the mid 18th century. So they come from this very interesting philosophical place of this burgeoning democratic sense that would inspire European revolutions over the next century or so, and really started here in the United States. And they come very much out of this educational intellectual tradition, and they're two elite moneyed men, and here they're just like John Hancock's really, he's hesitant and he's scared, and he's such a I don't even know, like they're making him such a wimp in this. It's so odd. I mean, yeah, Hancock probably wasn't a bold fighter who went out and fired a musket. That probably wasn't his place. But once again, he's an older man. He's much in the way that Adams is. I believe he's in his 40s to 50s during this period, and because they both died right around 1800 after having served both as governor of Massachusetts. But this was an older, smart guy who began to see the advantage of revolution and began to push for it as early as the 1760s when the taxation issue started. And so this hesitant wimp they portray in Sons of Liberty seems an odd portrayal. And then let's move on to John Adams. Now, I'm a huge fan of John Adams. I know a lot about John Adams. And so the first thing that strikes me is really, really odd about this is they make it seems like John Adams is protecting Sam Adams. He's like playing like the older brother, and that instantly struck me as really odd because I know for a fact that John Adams was 13 years younger than Sam Adams. Yet John was the much younger cousin, and they weren't that familiar with each other until 1770 when John Adams defended the soldiers from the famous Boston Massacre, and then they sort of began to interline politically and start to move towards this revolutionary period. Before this, they knew of each other and they knew who each other were, but they weren't friends. They weren't that close. They lived quite a ways apart. Remember, John Adams lives in Braintree, and Sam Adams lives in Boston. Now they're not that. Now I think it's all basically one big metropolitan area today. But at the time, it was like 15, 20 miles apart, and that's a big distance in colonial area America. So they probably didn't spend a lot of time together. They, like I said, they knew each other. They were aware of each other. They were each other's views because they were printed publicly, and so it was actually Sam Adams who would convince John Adams to get involved with the revolution, because remember, he's a much younger man. So when the revolution's all coming about, Sam Adams is in his 40s and his 50s. Well, John Adams, he's a full decade behind, right? So he's around. He'd have been late 30s when he defended the Boston Massacre soldiers, and then into his 40s when Declaration of Independence is actually signed. So that the thing that they describe in Sons of Liberty with this is sort of older brother situation of John Adams over Sam Adams is really strange to me. It's historically knowledgeable. That other than that, John Adams is actually one of the more decent portrayals in this, because he's hesitant at first, wants to go with rule of law, then eventually comes around to independence when it becomes clear that there's no other choice. And that's actually how John Adams' cycle works. So actually it's a little close to right, except for the relationship with Sam Adams, which as a historian it struck me as so strange. And let's see what other portrayals before we get on to the villains. Let's stick with the good guys, the heroes. We have Dean Norris from Breaking Bad. He played Hank in Breaking Bad, for those familiar with that show, playing Ben Franklin. He's not in it very much, so they really couldn't screw it up, and they really concentrate on Franklin's hedonistic side, which seems to be the sort of popular right now, right, to go see. Ben Franklin was a hedonist. He liked loose women, and he experimented with drugs and things like that. And he really liked his alcohol. And so we're gonna that's what we're gonna go with, is that Franklin liked alcohol and women, despite the fact that he was the foremost genius of his day, right? Invented bifocals, a stove, post office, all sorts of talented things that Ben Franklin did. But yet we really like to focus on his love of horrors, it seems like, which is neither here nor there. And to Dean Norris's credit, he didn't do a bad job as Franklin. But a real quick note on the acting is that most of the acting in this isn't terribly good. It's pretty average to poor. Ray Spall, who plays John Hancock, kind of go back to that one real quick. He's probably one of the worst. Every line he delivers, he sounds like he's running out of breath by the time he finishes. I'm not sure. He's like, and it's this weird delivery all throughout, and it just adds to the very strange quality of this mini series. So Ben Franklin, we have John Sam Adams, John Hancock, Ben Franklin, George Washington, which I hated the portrayal of. Betrayal is actually probably correct. Portrayal of Washington in this. They have him standing up and being real authoritative and giving speeches at the Continental Congress, which is very unlike the real George Washington. George Washington was a very quiet, humble, shy person. Very rarely spoke in public, and when he did, he tended to be very quiet. And famously, his first inaugural address as president was so quiet, people literally in the front row were struggling to hear what he was saying. His confirmation. So Washington was not, despite being a pretty good military leader, was not like a big public presence at a debate. That wasn't his style. And having him standing up saying Thomas Gage is cancer, which is one of the lines from the miniseries, is an unusual thing. You wouldn't, like, historically George Washington, you wouldn't have expected him to stand up and say something like that. And so it's just, it goes against what I know historically about George Washington, and that's once again where I get problems. Joseph Warren is portrayed in this. A lot of people may not know who Joseph Warren was, so that was actually kind of interesting that they got him in. He was a doctor, and he was very much on the side of the revolution, and he was killed at Bunker Hill. They get his death wrong in this. They say that Thomas Gage personally shot him in the back of the head for... I'll get into that in just a second. But yeah, he was shot in the head towards the end of the battle, and his death became sort of a rallying cry, for... Joseph Warren. He was shot in the head late in the battle, and they believe he was targeted. And there's a lot of rumor about who shot him. Most of the popular ones is, I can't remember now. I'm forgetting the name now, but there's a British lord who was in the military who supposedly caught Joseph Warren. Regardless, so he does get portrayed in this. And okay, let's go into this. Thomas Gage, who was the general who took over Massachusetts as governor, this is the worst. The British in this are the worst portrayals. First you have Hutchinson, who's governor of Massachusetts when all the disputes with the taxes erupted. Hutchinson, in reality, he was inept. He just didn't know how to deal with the upheaval. He was local. He was a Boston man basically, but they actually portrayed him as some sort of outsider in this, which is odd because Hutchinson was a Boston man. He was from the area basically. He lived there a lot of his life, but he was Lord of the Crown, and he thought, well, everybody will just go along because I'm Lord of the Crown, they're just as Lord of the Crown as I am. But that wasn't the case, and so Hutchinson ends up fumbling and really struggling with the unrest that started, and really makes things worse. Hutchinson accelerated the situation by not being able to impose any sort of authority or convince anybody that the British were right to impose the taxes. So he ends up as just a poor governor. And in this, he's portrayed as just a fool who is pushing all those bad rebels. Oh, he almost feels like he should be shaking his fist, or almost Bond villain-esque stroking a cat. I will get that Sam Adams. It's so silly and over the top, and it really once again goes against the grain. And then Thomas Gage shows up, General Thomas Gage, who's actually very popular to that point. When he first arrives in Massachusetts, actually everybody in Massachusetts was kind of happy to see him because he had a good reputation there. He'd fought in the French and Indian Wars. He fought in Pontiac's Rebellion. He'd been a very good administrator in Quebec when the British took over Canada. He'd been thought of very well there. And so they thought, hey, we'll put in Thomas Gage, who will strike a peace. He'll get everything calmed down. The problem was at the same time, Parliament sends down basically what became known as the Intolerable Acts, where they basically shut down Boston Harbor. Now Gage is in a really bad position because he's trying to convince everything's okay while the British government is sort of clamping down on things. And of course he's a military man, so everybody's like, well, they sent the military man because they're clamping down. and Gage is in reality is very wishy-washy, and he lets the Sons of Liberty exist, which a lot of people have actually come back to criticize him for, and people at the time in England criticized him, but because he's trying to make peace with them. He doesn't want to make war. He's actually trying really hard not to get in a fight. He ends up in the fight, and he ends up at Bunker Hill's his last battle. Which by the way, they show him in New York, the Battle of New York after Bunker Hill, which isn't true. After Bunker Hill, he was sent back to England. He was recalled, and where he was retired, and then he actually came back for a short period. But regardless, was trying to reach out. But in this, he is in the Sons of Liberty. He is shown as this preening, unbelievable villain. Just, ooh, he's so evil. He beats his wife. They actually show him beating his wife, which is no historical reference for. I decided I'm going to look back and see if I can find any historical reference for Thomas Gage having an abusive relationship with his wife, and none. And then they show Joseph Warren going and comforting her, and they have an affair with Gage's wife and her because she's a native New Jerseyan, and that makes her American. They're all British. Everybody in this story is British up to this point, and everybody would have thought of themselves as British until about 1775, when people started to realize this isn't working out anymore. And then they have Gage very eventually shooting Warren in the head at Bunker Hill, which isn't true because Gage was nowhere near the front lines when Warren was killed. In fact, I don't think he went to the front lines of that entire battle. He's villainous and he's callous, and oh, the British, they're so evil, and it's just ridiculous. A child is shot by a Tory, one of their own is shot in battle, and they just callously march over him, and they're like the evil empire, the British, which is so wrong. The British, they make huge mistakes that lead to the American Revolution, but the idea that they were actively courting it by just being these incredible dicks is just weird, and this whole thing is false because of the relationship they set up, these purely good Americans and these completely evil British, and that's not how it was. That's just not true. The Americans had grievances, the British had taxes, and the British were in financial struggle. Following the French Indian War, the British had a lot of financial problems, so they tried to implement taxes on the Americans to help them pay for the war that they felt like they had fought to save them. The Americans, not being representative, feel that they don't deserve to be taxed because they're not represented. And so then you have an escalating dynamic between the two sides where paranoia grows on the American side and frustration grows on the British side, to the point where it becomes an intractable conflict where it's just, they have no choice but to go to war and eventually separate. There was no working relationship anymore between the British and the Americans. It was something that escalated. Gage arrived in Massachusetts fully expecting that he could calm the situation, but by the time he arrived, it was beyond help. There was almost nothing in retrospect Thomas Gage could have done to save the Massachusetts colony as a British colony. And he wasn't some preening villain who showed up to crush the colonists from the bold and noble Sam Adams. It's such a silly portrayal. This whole thing was awful. One of the most egregious things I found about this, and I was so irritated with this, at the end of one part, they show the Boston Massacre, 1770. The Boston Massacre takes place. At the very beginning of the next part is the Boston Tea Party, where they're throwing and making you kind of think, well, this led to the massacre and then the Tea Party, like they occurred one right after the other. But they didn't show the years of the Boston Massacre, but they show the year of the Boston Tea Party for 1773. At the end, it's like December 1773. Boston Massacre is 1770. There's over 3 years separation between the two events. So this this is part of a chain of events that led to this, but it's not the direct cause of this. We didn't get Crispus Attucks, who's the first person killed in the Boston Massacre, killed, and then we immediately throw their tea in the harbor. But this makes it seem like that was the case. And admittedly, you're kind of covering broad historical events, but it's just, the whole thing is disingenuous. It's to make the Americans look like the complete and utter right good guys, and the British look like these incredible villainous Bond-level villains. They're Bond-level villains. Kill children, beat women, don't care for their own. I'm dreaded to think people watched this and thought this was legitimate history anyway, because it's bad history. If you want to watch good Revolutionary era history in a drama, Paul Giamatti and John Adams. This is great. This has problems. This has historical inaccuracy. But overall, the tone of this, the events that take place, everything is much more correct. This is really good. This is what historical drama should be. This is solid. This is 8 parts that cover the life of John Adams relatively well. They leave things out there as an action. I mean, like I said, this isn't perfect, but this is really good. And I would recommend, I've watched this many times. I really like this. It tries to take a very legitimate look at the people, actors, and characters in the Revolutionary War period. And it points out the problems of declaring independence. That's another thing. When they get to, in Sons of Liberty, when they get to Constitutional Hall, they're having the Continental Congress, and Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who was largely one of the voices against declaring independence. That he's seen as this really meek villain because he doesn't want to declare independence. He's afraid of the British. But that's so not fair. Dickinson in the debates had very good points about why the United States needed to be cautious in declaring independence. Did they have the means? Did they have the military? Would it be financially feasible? He was bringing up really good practical questions the entire time, and they show him storming out when they finally vote for independence, which he didn't do. He stayed there. He stayed there and accepted Pennsylvania's vote for independence. He was still very tenuous, but he became a supporter of he wasn't like some Tory who ran off with the British. No, he stayed in the United States and became a signer of the Declaration of Independence. It's treating someone. I feel like this disrespects Sam Adams, it disrespects Thomas Gage, it disrespects John Hancock, and then Dixon, and pretty much almost everybody portrayed here, because it's not who they really were. It's just this really false bravado version of that person, and either an extreme good or an extreme bad. It ignores the fact that they were an actual person. It makes them a caricature of a person. And I hate it. I'm going to come out and say that I hate this miniseries. I watched the first part and I wanted to quit, but I felt like I really want to do a critique of this. I want to sit down and talk about all the problems with this. And I know it's probably been quite a lengthy conversation because there's so much wrong with Sons of Liberty. And I hope I'm not the only one who steps up today and goes, this was bad. It was bad history, it was bad academia, and anybody who watches and believes the legitimacy of it is unfortunate to think that way. So there you have it, Sons of Liberty. I mean, I actually have more criticisms of this, believe it or not. Like, I have like little ones to big ones to just, I think I've hit on most of the major points that I found wrong with this. There are lots of little things, like Thomas Jefferson was short. I don't know why that bothered me, but Thomas Jefferson was shorter than John Adams. In reality, Thomas Jefferson was over 6 feet tall, and John Adams was like 5'7". And I don't know why when they had the two guys playing Adams and Jefferson stand together, and all of a sudden Adams is taller than Jefferson, I was like, that's odd. that's one very minor complaint compared to, the fact that they didn't get almost anything else right. Just, it's so bad. And I invite comments below as we can talk about more of what was wrong with this, or maybe you like this. Like, somebody tell me why they like this. I thought the acting was bad, I thought the storytelling was poor. Even if you were to ignore the really bad history, the other elements that make good TV and film weren't even that good. So, all right, well, there you have it. There's my take on Sons of Liberty and my deep criticism for it. So thanks, and I hope that gives you a little historical perspective.